Section 11 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 7, Great Women, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, Part 2. Meanwhile, a renewed war was declared against Louis XIV. On account of his determination to place his grandson on the throne of Spain. The Tories were bitterly opposed to this war of the Spanish succession, as unnecessary, expensive, and ruinous to the development of national industry. They were also jealous of Marlborough, whose power they feared would be augmented by the war, as the commander in chief of the united Dutch and English forces. And the result was indeed what they feared. His military successes were so great in this war that on his return to England he was created a duke, and soon after received unusual grants from Parliament, controlled by the Whigs, which made him the richest man in England as well as the most powerful politically. Yet even up to this time the relations between his wife and the Queen were apparently most friendly. But soon after this the haughty favourite became imprudent in the expressions she used before her royal mistress. She began to weary of the drudgeries of her office as Mistress of the Robes, and turned over her duties partially to a waiting woman, who was destined ultimately to supplant her in the royal favour. The Queen was wounded to the quick by some things that the Duchess said and did, which she was supposed not to hear or see, for the Duchess was now occasionally careless as well as insolent. The Queen was forced to perceive that the Duchess disdained her feeble intellect and some of her personal habits, and was, moreover, hostile to her political opinions, and she began to long for an independence she had never truly enjoyed. But the Duchess, intoxicated with power and success, did not see the ground on which she stood. Yet if she continued to rule her mistress, it was by fear rather than love. About this period, 1706, the struggles and hostilities of the Whigs and Tories were at their height. We have in these times but a feeble conception of the bitterness of the strife of these two great parties in the beginning of the 18th century. It divided families and filled the land with slanders and intrigues. The leaders of both parties were equally aristocratic and equally opposed to reform. Both held the people in sovereign contempt. The struggle between them was simply a struggle for place and emolument. The only real difference in their principles was that one party was secretly in favor of the exiled family and was opposed to the French war, and the other was more jealously Protestant and was in favor of the continuance of the war. The Tories accused Marlborough of needlessly prolonging the war in order to advance his personal interests, from which charge it would be difficult to acquit him. One of the most prominent leaders of the Tories was Harley, afterwards Earl of Oxford, who belonged to a Puritan family in Hertfordshire, and was originally a Whig. He entered Parliament in the early part of the reign of William. Macaulay, who could see no good in the Tories, in his violent political prejudices, maintained that Harley was not a man of great breadth of intellect, and exerted an influence in Parliament disproportionate to his abilities. But he was a most insidious and effective enemy. He was sagacious enough to perceive the growing influence of men of letters, and became their patron and friend. He advanced the fortunes of Pope, Arbuthnot, and Prior. He purchased the services of Swift, the greatest master of satire, blended with bitter invective, that England had known. Harley was not eloquent in speech, but he was industrious, learned, exact, and was always listened to with respect. Nor had he any scandalous vices. He could not be corrupted by money, and his private life was decorous. He abhorred both gambling and drunkenness, the fashionable vices of that age. He was a refined, social, and cultivated man. This statesman perceived that it was imperatively necessary for the success of his party to undermine the overpowering influence of the Duchess of Marlborough with the Queen. He detested her arrogance, disdain, and grasping ambition. Moreover, he had the firm conviction that England should engage only in maritime war. He hated the Dutch and moneyed men, and dissenters of every sect, although originally one of them. And when he had obtained the leadership of his party in the House of Commons, he brought to bear the whole force of his intellect against both the Duke and Duchess. It was by his intrigues that the intimate relations between the Duchess and the Queen were broken up, and that the Duke became unpopular. The great instrument by which he effected the disgrace of the imperious Duchess was a woman who was equally his cousin and the cousin of the Duchess, and for whom the all-powerful favourite had procured the office of chamberwoman and dresser. In other words, a position which in an inferior rank is called that of lady's maid. For the Duchess was wearied of constant attendance on the Queen, and to this woman some of her old duties were delegated. The name of this woman was Abigail Hill. She had been in very modest circumstances, but was a person of extraordinary tact, prudence, and discretion, though very humble in her address, qualities the reverse of those which marked her great relative. Nor did the proud Duchess comprehend Miss Hill's character and designs any more than the all-powerful Madame de Montespan comprehended those of the widow Scarron when she made her the governess of her children. But Harley understood her, and their principles and aims were in harmony. Abigail Hill was a bigoted Tory, and her supreme desire was to ingratiate herself in the favour of her royal mistress, especially when she was tired of the neglect or annoyed by the railleries of her exacting favourite. By degrees the humble lady's maid obtained the same ascendency over the Queen that had been exercised by the mistress of the robes, in the one case secured by humility, assiduous attention, and constant flatteries; in the other, obtained by talent and brilliant fascinations. Abigail was ruled by Harley. Sarah was ruled by no one but her husband, who understood her caprices and resentments, and seldom directly opposed her. Moreover, she was a strong-minded woman, who could listen to reason after her fits of passion had passed away. The first thing of note which occurred, showing to the Duchess that her influence was undermined, was a refusal of the Queen to allow Lord Cowper, the Lord Chancellor, to fill up the various livings belonging to the Crown, in spite of the urgent solicitations of the Duchess. This naturally produced a coolness between Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Morley. Harley was now the confidential adviser of the Queen, and counselled her to "go alone," that is, to throw off the shackles which she had too long ignominiously worn; and Anne at once appointed high church divines, Tories of course, to the 2 vacant bishoprics. The understream of faction was flowing unseen, but deep and strong, which the infatuated Duchess did not suspect. The great victory of Ramillies (1706) gave so much éclat to Marlborough that the outbreak between his wife and the Queen was delayed for a time. That victory gave a new lease of power to the Whigs. Harley and St. John, the secret enemies of the Duke, welcomed him with their usual smiles and flatteries, and even voted for the erection of Blenheim, one of the most expensive palaces ever built in England. Meanwhile Harley pursued his intrigues to effect the downfall of the Duchess. Miss Hill, unknown to her great relative and patroness, married Mr. Masham, equerry to Prince George, who was shortly after made a brigadier general and peer. Nothing could surpass the indignation of the Duchess when she heard of this secret marriage. That it should be concealed from her while it was known to the Queen showed conclusively that her power over Anne was gone. And still further, she perceived that she was supplanted by a relative whom she had raised from obscurity. She now comprehended the great influence of Harley at court, and also the declining favour of her husband. It was a bitter reflection to the proud Duchess that the alienation of the Queen was the result of her own folly and pride, rather than of royal capriciousness. She now paid no inconsiderable penalty for the neglect of her mistress and the gratification of her pride. Pride has ever been the chief cause of the downfall of royal favourites. It ruined Louvois, Wolsey, and Thomas Cromwell; it broke the chain which bound Louis XIV to the imperious Montespan. It ever goes before destruction. The Duchess of Marlborough forgot that her friend Mrs. Morley was also her sovereign, the Queen. She might have retained the Queen's favour to the end, in spite of political opinions, but she presumed too far on the ascendency which she had enjoyed for nearly 30 years. There is no height from which one may not fall, and it takes more ability to retain a proud position than to gain it. There are very few persons who are beyond the reach of envy and detraction, and the loftier the position one occupies, the more subtle, numerous, and desperate are one's secret enemies. The Duchess was not, however, immediately disgraced, as the expression is in reference to great people who lose favour at court. She still retained her offices and her apartments in the royal palace; she still had access to the Queen; she was still addressed as "My dear Mrs. Freeman." But Mrs. Masham had supplanted her, and Harley, through the influence of the new favourite, ruled at court. The disaffection which had long existed between the Secretary of State and the Lord Treasurer deepened into absolute aversion. It became the aim of both ministers to ruin each other. The Queen now secretly sided with the Tories, although she had not the courage to quarrel openly with her powerful ministers, or with her former favourite. Nor was the great breach made public. But the angry and disappointed Duchess gave vent to her wrath and vengeance in letters to her husband and in speech to Godolphin. She entreated them to avenge her quarrel. She employed spies about the Queen. She brought to bear her whole influence on the leaders of the Whigs. She prepared herself for an open conflict with her sovereign, for she saw clearly that the old relations of friendship and confidence between them would never return. A broken friendship is a broken jar; it may be mended, but never restored; its glory has departed. And this is one of the bitterest experiences of life, on whomsoever the fault may be laid. The fault in this instance was on the side of the Duchess, and not on that of her patron. The arrogance and dictation of the favorite had become intolerable; it was as hard to bear as the insolence of a petted servant. The Duke of Marlborough and Lord Godolphin took up the quarrel with zeal. They were both at the summit of power, and both were leaders of their party. The victories of the former had made him the most famous man in Europe and the greatest subject in England. They declined to serve their sovereign any longer unless Harley were dismissed from office, and the able Secretary of State was obliged to resign. But Anne could not forget that she was forced to part with her confidential minister, and continued to be ruled by his counsels. She had secret nocturnal meetings in the palace with both Harley and Mrs. Masham, to the chagrin of the ministers. The court became the scene of intrigues and cabals. Not only was Harley dismissed, but also Henry St. John, afterwards the famous Lord Bolingbroke, the intimate friend and patron of Pope. He was Secretary of War, and was a man of great ability, of more genius even than Harley. He was an infidel in his religious opinions, and profligate in his private life. Like Harley, he was born of Puritan parents, and, like him, repudiated his early principles. He was the most eloquent orator in the House of Commons, which he entered in 1700 as a Whig. At that time he was much admired by Marlborough, who used his influence to secure his entrance into the cabinet. His most remarkable qualities were political sagacity and penetration into the motives and dispositions of men. He gradually went over to the Tories, and his alliance with Harley was strengthened by personal friendship as well as political sympathies. He was the most interesting man of his age in society, witty, bright, and courtly. In conversational powers he was surpassed only by Swift. Meanwhile the breach between the Queen and the Duchess gradually widened. As the former grew cold in her treatment of her old friend, she at the same time annoyed her ministers by the appointment of Tory bishops to the vacant sees. She went so far as to encroach on the prerogatives of the general of her armies by making military appointments without his consent. This interference Marlborough properly resented. But his influence was now on the wane, as the nation wearied of a war which, as it seemed to the Tories, he needlessly prolonged. Moreover, the Duke of Somerset, piqued by the refusal of the general to give a regiment to his son, withdrew his support from the government. The Duke of Shrewsbury and other discontented noblemen left the Whig party. The unwise prosecution of Dr. Sacheverell for a seditious libel united the whole Tory party in a fierce opposition to the government, which was becoming every day more unpopular. Harley was indefatigable in intrigues. He fasted with religious zealots and feasted with convivial friends. He promised everything to everybody, but kept his own counsels. In such a state of affairs, with the growing alienation of the Queen, it became necessary for the proud Duchess to resign her offices, but before doing this she made one final effort to regain what she had lost. She besought the Queen for a private interview, which was refused. Again importuned, Her Majesty sullenly granted the interview, but refused to explain anything, and even abruptly left the room, and was so rude that the Duchess burst into a flood of tears which she could not restrain, not tears of grief, but tears of wrath and shame. Thus was finally ended the memorable friendship between Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, which had continued for 27 years. The Queen and Duchess never met again. Soon after, in 1710, followed the dismissal of Lord Godolphin as Lord Treasurer, who was succeeded by Harley, created Earl of Oxford. Sunderland too was dismissed, and his post of Secretary of State was given to St. John, created Viscount Bolingbroke. Lord Cowper resigned the seals, and Sir Simon Harcourt, an avowed adherent of the Pretender, became Lord Chancellor. The Earl of Rochester, the bitterest of all the Tories, was appointed President of the Council. The Duke of Marlborough, however, was not dismissed from his high command until 1711. One reason for his dismissal was that he was suspected of aiming to make himself supreme. On his return from the battle of Malplaquet, he had coolly demanded to be made Captain General for life. Such a haughty demand would have been regarded as dangerous in a great crisis; it was absurd when public dangers had passed away. Even Lord Cowper, his friend the Chancellor, shrunk from it with amazement. Such a demand would have been deemed arrogant in Wallenstein amid the successes of Gustavus Adolphus. No insignificant cause of the triumph of the Tory party at this time was the patronage which the Tory leaders extended to men of letters, and the bitter political tracts which these literary men wrote and for which they were paid. In that age the speeches of members of Parliament were not reported or published, and hence had but little influence on public opinion. Even ministers resorted to political tracts to sustain their power, or to undermine that of their opponents, and these were more efficient than speeches in the House of Commons. Bolingbroke was the most eloquent orator of his day, but no orators arose in Anne's reign equal to Pitt and Fox in the reign of George III. Hence political leaders availed themselves of the writings of men of letters, with whom they freely associated. And this intercourse was deemed a great condescension on the part of nobles and cabinet ministers. In that age great men were not those who were famous for genius, but those who were exalted in social position. Still, genius was held in high honor by those who controlled public affairs, whenever it could be made subservient to their interests. Foremost among the men of genius who lent their pen to the service of nobles and statesmen was Jonathan Swift, clergyman, poet, and satirist. But he was more famous for his satire than for his sermons or his poetry. Everybody winced under his terrible assaults. He was both feared and hated, especially by the great; hence they flattered him and courted his society. He became the intimate friend and companion of Oxford and Bolingbroke. He dined with the prime minister every Sunday, and in fact as often as he pleased. He rarely dined at home, and almost lived in the houses of the highest nobles, who welcomed him not only for the aid he gave them by his writings, but for his wit and agreeable discourse. At one time he was the most influential man in England, although poor and without office or preferment. He possessed 2 or 3 livings in Ireland, which together brought him about £500, on which he lived, generally in London, at least when his friends were in power. They could not spare him, and he was entrusted with the most important secrets of state. His insolence was superb. He affected equality with dukes and earls; he condescended to accept their banquets. The first time that Bolingbroke invited him to dine, his reply was that, if the Queen gave his lordship a dukedom and the Garter and the Treasury also, he would regard them no more than he would a groat. This assumed independence was the habit of his life. He indignantly returned £100 to Harley, which the minister had sent him as a gift. He did not work for money, but for influence and a promised bishopric. But the Queen, a pious woman of the conventional school, would never hear of his elevation to the bench of bishops, in consequence of the tale of a tub, in which he had ridiculed everything sacred and profane. He was the bitterest satirist that England has produced. The most his powerful friends could do for him was to give him the deanery of St. Patrick's in Dublin, worth about £800 a year. Swift was first brought to notice by Sir William Temple, in the reign of William and Mary, he being Sir William's secretary. At first he was a Whig and a friend of Addison, but, neglected by Marlborough and Godolphin, who cared but little for literary genius, he became a Tory. In 1710 he became associated with Harley, St. John, Atterbury, and Prior, in the defence of the Tory party, but he never relinquished his friendship with Addison, for whom he had profound respect and admiration. Swift's life was worldly but moral. He was remarkably temperate in eating and drinking, and parsimonious in his habits. One of his most bitter complaints in his letters to Stella, to whom he wrote every day, was of the expense of coach hire in his visits to nobles and statesmen. It would seem that he creditably discharged his clerical duties. He attended the daily service in the cathedral, and preached when his turn came. He was charitable to the poor, and was a friend to Ireland, to whose people he rendered great services from his influence with the government. He was beloved greatly by the Irish nation, in spite of his asperity, parsimony, and bad temper. He is generally regarded by critics as a selfish and heartless man, and his treatment of the 2 women whose affections he had gained was certainly inexplicable and detestable. His old age was miserable and sad. He died insane, having survived his friends and his influence. But his writings have lived. His Gulliver's Travels is still one of the most famous and popular books in our language, in spite of its revolting and vulgar details. Swift, like Addison, was a great master of style, clear, forcible, and natural, and in vigor he surpassed any writer of his age. Section 12 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 7, Great Women, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, Part 3. It was the misfortune of the Duchess of Marlborough to have this witty and malignant satirist for an enemy. He exposed her peculiarities, and laid bare her character with fearless effrontery. It was thus that he attacked the most powerful woman in England. A lady of my acquaintance appropriated £26 a year out of her allowance for certain uses which the lady received, or was to pay to the lady or her order when called for. But after 8 years it appeared upon the strictest calculation that the woman had paid but £4 and sunk £22 for her own pocket. It is but supposing £26 instead of £26,000, and by that you may judge what the pretensions of modern merit are when it happens to be its own paymaster. Who could stand before such insinuations? The Duchess afterwards attempted to defend herself against the charge of peculation as the keeper of the privy purse, but no one believed her. She was notoriously avaricious and unscrupulous. Swift spared no personage in the party of the Whigs, when by so doing he could please the leaders of the Tories. And he wrote in an age when libels were scandalous and savage, libels which would now subject their authors to punishment. The acrimony of party strife at that time has never since been equalled. Even poets attacked each other with savage recklessness. There was no criticism after the style of Sainte Beuve. Writers sought either to annihilate or to extravagantly praise. The jealousy which poets displayed in reference to each other's productions was as unreasonable and bitter as the envy and strife between country doctors or musicians at the opera. There was one great writer in the age of Queen Anne who was an exception to this nearly universal envy and bitterness, and this was Addison, who was as serene and calm as other critics were furious and unjust. Even Swift spared this amiable and accomplished writer, although he belonged to the Whig party. Joseph Addison, born in 1672, was the most fortunate man of letters in his age, perhaps in any succeeding age in English history. He was early distinguished as a writer of Latin poems, and in 1699, at the age of 27, the young scholar was sent by Montague, at the recommendation of Somers, to the Continent, on a pension of £300 a year, to study languages with a view to the diplomatic service. On the accession of Anne, Addison was obliged to return to literature for his support. Solicited by Godolphin, under the advice of Halifax, to write a poem on the victories of Marlborough, he wrote one so popular that he rapidly rose in favor with the Whig ministry. In 1708 he was made the Secretary for Ireland, under Lord Wharton, and entered Parliament. He afterwards was made Secretary of State, married a peeress, and spent his last days at Holland House. But Addison was no politician, nor did he distinguish himself in Parliament or as a political writer. He could not make a speech, not having been trained to debate. He was too timid, and his taste was too severe for the arena of politicians. He is immortal for his essays, in which his humor is transcendent, and his style easy and graceful. As a writer, he is a great artist. No one has ever been able to equal him in the charming simplicity of his style. Macaulay, a great artist himself in the use of language, places Addison on the summit of literary excellence and fame as an essayist. One is at loss to comprehend why so quiet and unobtrusive a scholar should have been selected for important political positions, but can easily understand why he was the admiration of the highest social circles for his wit and the elegance of his conversation. He was the personification of urbanity and every gentlemanly quality, as well as one of the best scholars of his age; but it was only in an aristocratic age, when a few great nobles controlled public affairs, that such a man could have been so recognized, rewarded, and honored. He died beloved and universally lamented, and his writings are still classics, and likely to remain so. He was not an oracle in general society like Mackintosh and Macaulay, but among congenial and trusted friends he gave full play to his humor, and was as charming as Washington Irving is said to have been in his chosen circle of admirers. Although he was a Whig, we do not read of any particular intimacy with such men as Marlborough and Godolphin. Marlborough, though an accomplished and amiable man, was not fond of the society of wits, as were Halifax, Montague, Harley, and St. John. As for the Duchess, she was too proud and grand for such a retired scholar as Addison to feel at ease in her worldly coteries. She cared no more for poetry or severe intellectual culture than politicians generally do. She shone only in a galaxy of ladies of rank and fashion. I do not read that she ever took a literary man into her service, and she had no more tastes for letters than the sovereign she served. She was doubtless intellectual, shrewd, and discriminating, but her intellect was directed to current political movements, and she was coarse in her language. She would swear, like Queen Elizabeth, when excited to anger, and her wrath was terrible. On the dismissal of the great Duke from all his offices, and the disgrace of his wife at court, they led a comparatively quiet life abroad. The Duchess had parted with her offices with great reluctance. Even when the Queen sent for the golden keys, which were the badge of her office, she refused to surrender them. No one could do anything with the infuriated termagant; all were afraid of her. She threatened to print the private correspondence of the Queen as Mrs. Morley. The ministers dared not go into her presence, so fierce was her character when offended. To take from her the badge of office was like trying to separate a fierce lioness from her whelps. The only person who could manage her was her husband, and when at last he compelled her to give up the keys, she threw them in a storm of passion at his head, and raved like a maniac. It is amazing how the Queen could have borne so long with the Duchess's ungovernable temper, and still more so how her husband could. But he was always mild and meek in the retirement of his home, a truly domestic man, to whom pomp was a weariness. Moreover, he was a singularly fortunate man. His ambition and pride and avarice were gratified beyond precedent in English history. He had become the foremost man in his country, and perhaps of his age. And his wife was still looked to as a great personage, not only because of her position and rank, but for her abilities, which were doubtless great. She was still a power in the land, and was surrounded by children and grandchildren who occupied some of the highest social positions in England. But she was not happy. What can satisfy a restless and ambitious woman whose happiness is in external pleasures? There is a limit to the favors which fortune showers, and when the limits of success are reached, there must be disappointment. The Duchess was discontented and became morose, quarrelsome, and hard to please. Her children did not love her, and some were in bitter opposition to her. She was perpetually embroiled in family quarrels. Nothing could soften the asperity of her temper, or restrain her unreasonable exactions. At last England became hateful to her, and she and her husband quitted it, and resided abroad for several years. In the retirement of voluntary exile she answered the numerous accusations against her, for she was maligned on every side, and generally disliked, since her arrogance had become insupportable, even to her daughters. Meanwhile the last days of Queen Anne's weary existence were drawing to a close. She was assailed with innumerable annoyances. Her body was racked with the gout, and her feeble mind was distracted by the contradictory counsels of her advisers. Any allusion to her successor was a knell of agony to her disturbed soul. She became suspicious, and was even alienated from Harley, whom she dismissed from office only a few days before her death, which took place August 1st, 1714. She died without signing her will, by which omission Mrs. Masham was deprived of her legacy. She died childless, and the Elector George of Hanover ascended her throne. On the death of the Queen, Marlborough returned to England, and it was one of the first acts of the new King to restore to him the post of Captain General of the Land Forces, while his son-in-law Sunderland was made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. A Whig cabinet was formed, but the Duke never regained his old political influence, and he gradually retired to private life, residing with the Duchess almost wholly at Holywell. His peaceful retirement, for which he had longed, came at last. He employed his time in surveying the progress of the building of Blenheim, in which palace he was never destined to live, and in simple pleasures, for which he never lost a taste. His wife occupied herself in matrimonial projects for her grandchildren, seeking alliances of ambition and interest. In 1716 the Duke of Marlborough was attacked with a paralytic fit, from the effects of which he only partially recovered. To restore his health he went to Bath, then the fashionable and favorite watering place, whose waters were deemed beneficial to invalids; and here it was one of the scandals of the day that the rich nobleman would hobble from the public room to his lodgings in a cold dark night to save sixpence in coach hire. His enjoyments were now few and transient. His nervous system was completely shattered, after so many labors and exposures in his numerous campaigns. He lingered till 1722, when he died, leaving a fortune of £1.5 million sterling, besides his vast estates. No subject at that time had so large an income. He left a military fame never surpassed in England, except by Wellington, and a name unstained by cruelty. So distinguished a man, of course, received at his death unparalleled funeral honors. He was followed to his temporary resting place in the vaults of Westminster by the most imposing procession that England had ever seen. The Duchess of Marlborough was now the richest woman in England. Whatever influence proceeds from rank and riches she still possessed, though the titles and honors of the dukedom descended by Act of Parliament, in 1706, to the Countess of Godolphin, with whom she was at war. The Duchess was now 62, with unbroken health and inextinguishable ambition. She resided chiefly at Windsor Lodge, for she held for life the office of Ranger of the Forest. It was then that she was so severely castigated by Pope in his satirical lines on Atossa, that she is said to have sent £1,000 to the poet to suppress the libel, her avarice and wrath giving way to her policy and pride. For 20 years after the death of her husband she continued an intriguing politician, but on ill terms with Sir Robert Walpole, the prime minister, whom she cordially hated, more because of money transactions than political disagreements. She was a very disagreeable old woman, yet not without influence, if she was without friends. She had at least the merit of frankness, for she concealed none of her opinions of the king, nor of his ministers, nor of distinguished nobles. She was querulous and full of complaints and exactions. One of her bitterest complaints was that she was compelled to pay taxes on her house in Windsor Park. She would even utter her complaints before servants. Litigation was not disagreeable to her if she had reason on her side, whether she had law or not. It was not the good fortune of this strong-minded but unhappy woman to assemble around her, in her declining years, children and grandchildren who were attached to her. She had alienated even them. She had no intimate friends. A woman not beloved by her own children can have but little claim to the affections of others. As we have already said, the Duchess was at open variance with her oldest daughter Henrietta, the Countess of Godolphin, to whom she was never reconciled. Her quarrels with her granddaughter, Lady Anne Egerton, afterwards Duchess of Bedford, were violent and incessant. She lived in perpetual altercation with her youngest daughter, the Duchess of Montague. She never was beloved by any of her children at any time, since they were in childhood and youth entrusted to the care of servants and teachers, while the mother was absorbed in political cabals at court. She consulted their interest merely in making for them grand alliances, to gratify her family pride. Her whole life was absorbed in pride and ambition. Nor did the mortification of a dishonored old age improve her temper. She sought neither the consolation of religion nor the intellectual stimulus of history and philosophy. To the last she was as worldly as she was morose. To the last she was a dissatisfied politician. She reviled the Whig administration of Walpole as fiercely as she did the Tory administration of Oxford. She haughtily refused the Order of the Bath for her grandson, the Duke of Marlborough, which Walpole offered, contented with nothing less than the Garter. "Madam," replied Walpole, "they who take the Bath will sooner have the Garter." In her old age her ruling passion was hatred of Walpole. "I think," she wrote, "'tis thought wrong to wish anybody dead, but I hope 'tis none to wish he may be hanged." Her wishes were partly gratified, for she lived long enough to see this great statesman, so long supreme, driven to the very threshold of the Tower. For his son Horace she had equal dislike, and he returned her hatred with malignant satire. "Old Marlborough is dying," said the wit, "but who can tell? Last year she had lain a great while ill, without speaking, and her physician told her that she must be blistered or she would die. She cried out, 'I won't be blistered and I won't die.' She did indeed last some time longer, but with increasing infirmities, her amusements and pleasures became yearly more circumscribed. In former years she had sometimes occupied her mind with the purchase of land, for she was shrewd, and rarely made a bad bargain. Even at the age of 80 she went to the City to bid in person for the estate of Lord Yarmouth. But as her darkened day approached its melancholy close, she amused herself by dictating in bed her vindication. After spending thus 6 hours daily with her secretary, she had recourse to her chamber organ, the 8 tunes of which she thought much better to hear than going to the Italian opera. Even society, in which she once shone, for her intellect was bright and her person beautiful, at last wearied her and gave her no pleasure. Like many lonely, discontented women, she became attached to animals. She petted 3 dogs, in which she saw virtues that neither men nor women possessed. In her disquiet she often changed her residence. She went from Marlborough House to Windsor Lodge, and from Windsor Lodge to Wimbledon, only to discover that each place was damp and unhealthy. Wrapped up in flannels and wheeled up and down her room in a chair, she discovered that wealth can only mitigate the evils of humanity, and realized how wretched is any person with a soul filled with discontent and bitterness, when animal spirits are destroyed by the infirmities of old age. All the views of this spoiled favorite of fortune were bounded by the scenes immediately before her. While she was not sceptical, she was far from being religious, and hence she was deprived of the highest consolations given to people in disappointment and sorrow and neglect. The older she grew, the more tenaciously did she cling to temporal possessions, and the more keenly did she feel occasional losses. Her intellect remained unclouded, but her feelings became callous. While she had no reverence for the dead, she felt increasing contempt for the living, forgetting that no one, however exalted, can live at peace in an atmosphere of disdain. At last she died in 1744, unlamented and unloved, in the 84th year of her age, and was interred by the side of her husband, in the tomb in the chapel of Blenheim. She left £30,000 a year to her grandson, Lord John Spencer, provided he would never accept any civil or military office from the government. She left also £20,000 to Lord Chesterfield, together with her most valuable diamond, but only small sums to most of her relatives or to charities. The residue of her property she left to that other grandson who inherited the title and estates of her husband. £60,000 a year, her estimated income, besides a costly collection of jewels, one of the most valuable in Europe, were a great property, when few noblemen at that time had over £30,000 a year. The life of Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, is a sad one to contemplate, with all her riches and honors. Let those who envy wealth or rank learn from her history how little worldly prosperity can secure happiness or esteem without the solid virtues of the heart. The richest and most prosperous woman of her times was the object of blended derision, contempt, and hatred throughout the land which she might have adorned. Why, then, it may be asked, should I single out such a woman for a lecture, a woman who added neither to human happiness, national prosperity, nor the civilization of her age? Why have I chosen her as one of the beacon lights of history? Because I know of no woman who has filled so exalted a position in society, and is so prominent a figure in history, whose career is a more impressive warning of the dangers to be shunned by those who embark on the perilous and troubled seas of mere worldly ambition. God gave her that to which she aspired, and which so many envy; but He sent leanness into her soul. Authorities. Private correspondence of the Duchess of Marlborough. Mrs. Thomson's Life of the Duchess of Marlborough. Conduct by the Duchess of Marlborough. Life of Dr. Tillotson by Dr. Birch. Cox's Life of the Duke of Marlborough. Evelyn's Diary. Lord Mahon's History of England. Macaulay's History of England. Lewis Jenkins' Memoirs of the Duke of Gloucester. Burnet's History of his Own Times. Lamberty's Memoirs. Swift's Journal to Stella. Lydiard's Life of the Duke of Marlborough. Boyer's Annals of Queen Anne. Swift's Memoir of the Queen's Ministry. Cunningham's History of Great Britain. Walpole's Correspondence, edited by Cox. Sir Walter Scott's Life of Swift. Agnes Strickland's Queens of England. Marlborough and the Times of Queen Anne. Westminster Review, 5626. Dublin University Review, 74, 469. Temple Bar Magazine, 52, 333. Burton's Reign of Queen Anne. Stanhope's Queen Anne. End of section 12. Section 13 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 7, Great Women, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Madame Récamier, Part 1. A.D. 1777 to 1849. The Woman of Society. I know of no woman who by the force of beauty and social fascinations, without extraordinary intellectual gifts or high birth, has occupied so proud a position as a queen of society as Madame Récamier. So I select her as the representative of her class. It was in Italy that women first drew to their salons the distinguished men of their age, and exercised over them a commanding influence. More than 300 years ago, Olympia, Fulvia, Murata, was the pride of Ferrara, eloquent with the music of Homer and Virgil, a miracle to all who heard her, giving public lectures to nobles and professors when only a girl of 16. And Vittoria Colonna was the ornament of the court of Naples, and afterwards drew around her at Rome the choicest society of that elegant capital, bishops, princes, and artists, equally the friend of Cardinal Pole and of Michael-Angelo, and reigning in her retired apartments in the Benedictine convent of St. Anne, even as the Duchess de Longueville shone at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, with De Retz and La Rochefoucauld at her feet. This was at a period when the Italian cities were the centre of the new civilization which the Renaissance created, when ancient learning and art were cultivated with an enthusiasm never since surpassed. The new position which women seem to have occupied in the 16th century in Italy was in part owing to the wealth and culture of cities, ever the paradise of ambitious women, and the influence of poetry and chivalry, of which the Italians were the earliest admirers. Provincial poetry was studied in Italy as early as the time of Dante, and veneration for woman was carried to a romantic excess when the rest of Europe was comparatively rude. Even in the 11th century we see in the southern part of Europe a respectful enthusiasm for woman coeval with the birth of chivalry. The gay troubadours expounded and explained the subtle metaphysics of love in every possible way. A peerless lady was supposed to unite every possible moral virtue with beauty and rank, and hence chivalric love was based on sentiment alone. Providence gave birth both to chivalry and poetry, and they were singularly blended together. Of about 500 troubadours whose names have descended to us, more than half were noble, for chivalry took cognizance only of noble birth. From Provence, chivalry spread to Italy and to the north of France, and Normandy became preeminently a country of noble deeds, though not the land of song. It was in Italy that the political development was greatest. After chivalry as an institution had passed away, it still left its spirit on society. There was not, however, much society in Europe anywhere until cities arose and became centres of culture and art. In the feudal castle there were chivalric sentiments, but not society, where men and women of cultivation meet to give expression and scope to their ideas and sentiments. Nor can there be a high society without the aid of letters. Society did not arise until scholars and poets mingled with nobles as companions. This sort of society gained celebrity first in Paris, when women of rank invited to their salons literary men as well as nobles. The first person who gave a marked impulse to what we call society was the Marquess de Rambouillet, in the 17th century. She was the first to set the fashion in France of that long series of social gatherings which were a sort of institution for more than 200 years. Her father was a devoted friend of Henry IV., belonged to one of the first families of France, and had been ambassador to Rome. She was married in the year 1600 at the age of 15. When 22, she had acquired a distaste for the dissipations of the court and everything like crowded assemblies. She was among the first to discover that a crowd of men and women does not constitute society. Nothing is more foreign to the genius of the highest cultivated life than a crowded salon where conversation on any interesting topic is impossible, where social life is gilded but frivolous and empty, where especially the loftiest sentiments of the soul are suppressed. From an early period such crowds gathered at courts, but it was not till the 17th century that the salon arose, in which woman was a queen and an institution. The famous queens of society in the 17th and 18th centuries do not seem to have mixed much in miscellaneous assemblies, however brilliant in dress and ornament. They were more exclusive. They reserved their remarkable talents for social reunions, perhaps in modest salons, where among distinguished men and women they could pour out the treasures of the soul and mind, where they could inspire and draw out the sentiments of those who were gifted and distinguished. Madame du Deffand lived quietly in the convent of St. Joseph, but she gathered around her an elegant and famous circle until she was 80 and blind. The Saturday assemblies of Mademoiselle de Scudéry, frequented by the most distinguished people of Paris, were given in a modest apartment, for she was only a novelist. The same may be said of the receptions of Madame de la Sablière, who was a childless widow, of moderate means. The Duchess de Longueville, another of those famous queens, saw her best days in the Abbey of Port Royal. Madame Récamier reigned in a small apartment in the Abbaye aux Bois. All these carried out in their salons the rules and customs which had been established by Madame de Rambouillet. It was in her salon that the French Academy originated, and its first members were regular visitants at her hotel. Her conversation was the chief amusement. We hear of neither cards nor music, but there were frequent parties to the country, walks in the woods, a perpetual animation, where ceremony was banished. The brilliancy of her parties excited the jealousy of Richelieu. Hither resorted those who did not wish to be bound by the stiffness of the court. At that period this famous hotel had its pedantries, but it was severely intellectual. Hither came Mademoiselle de Scudéry, Mademoiselle de Montpensier, granddaughter of Henry IV., Vaugelas, and others of the poets; also Balzac, Voiture, Racan, the Duc de Montpensier, Madame de Sévigné, Madame de Lafayette, and others. The most marked thing about this hotel was the patronage extended to men of letters. Those great French ladies welcomed poets and scholars, and encouraged them, and did not allow them to starve like the literary men of Grub Street. Had the English aristocracy extended the same helping hand to authors, the condition of English men of letters in the 18th century would have been far less unfortunate. Authors in France have never been excluded from high society, and this was owing in part to the influence of the Hôtel de Rambouillet, which sought an alliance between genius and rank. It is this blending of genius with rank which gave to society in France its chief attraction, and made it so brilliant. Mademoiselle de Scudéry, Madame de la Sablière, and Madame de Longueville followed the precedents established by Madame de Rambouillet and Madame de Maintenon, and successively reigned as queens of society, that is, of chosen circles of those who were the most celebrated in France, raising the intellectual tone of society and inspiring increased veneration for woman herself. But the most celebrated of all these queens of society was Madame Récamier, who was the friend and contemporary of Madame de Staël. She was born at Lyons in 1777, not of high rank, her father, Monsieur Bernard, being only a prosperous notary. Through the influence of Calonne, minister of Louis XVI., he obtained the lucrative place of receiver of the finances, and removed to Paris, while his only daughter Juliette was sent to a convent near Lyons to be educated, where she remained until she was 10 years of age, when she rejoined her family. Juliette's education was continued at home under her mother's superintendence, but she excelled in nothing especially except music and dancing, and was only marked for grace, beauty, and good nature. Among the visitors to her father's house was Jacques Rose Récamier, a rich banker, born in Lyons 1751, kind hearted, hospitable, fine looking, and cultivated, but of frivolous tastes. In 1793, during the Reign of Terror, being 42, he married the beautiful daughter of his friend, she being but 15. This marriage seems to have been one of convenience and vanity, with no ties of love on either side, scarcely friendship or even sentiment. For a few years Madame Récamier led a secluded life, on account of the troubles and dangers incident to the times; but when she did emerge from retirement she had developed into the most beautiful woman in France, and was devoted to a life of pleasure. Her figure was flexible and elegant, her head well poised, her complexion brilliant, with a little rosy mouth, pearly teeth, black curling hair, and soft expressive eyes, with a carriage indicative of indolence and pride, yet with a face beaming with good nature and sympathy. Such was Madame Récamier at 18, so remarkable for beauty that she called forth murmurs of admiration wherever she appeared. As it had long been a custom in Paris, and still is, to select the most beautiful and winning woman to hand round the purse in church for all charities, she was selected by the church of St. Roch, the most fashionable church of that day; and so great was the enthusiasm to see this beautiful and bewitching creature, that the people crowded the church and even mounted on the chairs, and, though assisted by 2 gentlemen, she could scarcely penetrate the crowd. The collection on one occasion amounted to 20,000 francs, equal perhaps to $10,000 to day. This adaptation of means to an end has never been disdained by the Catholic clergy. What would be thought in Philadelphia or New York, in an austere and solemn Presbyterian church, to see the most noted beauty of the day handing round the plate? But such is one of the forms which French levity takes, even in the consecrated precincts of the Church. The fashionable drive and promenade in Paris was Longchamp, now the Champs Élysées, and it was Madame Récamier's delight to drive in an open carriage on this beautiful avenue, especially on what are called holy days, Wednesdays and Fridays, when her beauty extorted salutations from the crowd. Of course, such a woman excited equal admiration in the salons, and was soon invited to the fêtes and parties of the Directory, through Barras, one of her admirers. There she saw Bonaparte, but did not personally know him at that time. At one of the fêtes, rising at full length from her seat to gaze at the general, sharing in the admiration for the hero, she at once attracted the notice of the crowd, who all turned to look at her, which so annoyed Bonaparte that he gave her one of his dreadful and withering frowns, which caused her to sink into her seat with terror. In 1798 Monsieur Récamier bought the house which had Récamier belonged to Necker, in what is now the Chaussée d'Antin. This led to an acquaintance between Madame Récamier and Madame de Staël, which soon ripened into friendship. In the following year Monsieur Récamier, now very rich, established himself in a fine château at Clichy, a short distance from Paris, where he kept open house. Thither came Lucien Bonaparte, at that time 24 years of age, bombastic and consequential, and fell in love with his beautiful hostess as everybody else did. But Madame Récamier, with all her fascinations, was not a woman of passion, nor did she like the brother of the powerful First Consul, and politely rejected his addresses. He continued, however, to persecute her with his absurd love letters for a year, when, finding it was hopeless to win so refined and virtuous a lady as Madame Récamier doubtless was, partly because she was a woman of high principles, and partly because she had no great temptations, the pompous lover, then home minister, ceased his addresses. But Napoleon, who knew everything that was going on, had a curiosity to see this woman who charmed everybody, yet whom nobody could win, and she was invited to one of his banquets. Although she obeyed his summons, she was very modest and timid, and did not try to make any conquest of him. She was afraid of him, as Madame de Staël was, and most ladies of rank and refinement. He was a hero to men rather than to women, at least to those women who happened to know him or serve him. The cold and cutting irony of which he was master, that haughty carriage and air which he assumed, that selfish and unsympathetic nature, that exacting slavery to his will, must have been intolerable to well-bred women who believed in affection and friendship, of which he was incapable, and which he did not even comprehend. It was his intention that the most famous beauty of the day should sit next to him at this banquet, and he left the seat vacant for her, but she was too modest to take it unless specially directed to do so by the Consul, which either pride or etiquette prevented. This modesty he did not appreciate, and he was offended, and she never saw him again in private; but after he became Emperor he made every effort to secure her services as maid of honour to one of the princesses, through his minister Fouché, in order to ornament his court. It was a flattering honour, since she was only the wife of a banker, without title, but she refused it, which stung Napoleon with vexation, since it indicated to him that the fashionable and high-born women of the day stood aloof from him. Many a woman was banished because she would not pay court to him, Madame de Staël, the Duchess de Chevreuse, and others. Madame Récamier was now at the height of fashion, admired by Frenchmen and foreigners alike, not merely by such men as the Montmorencys, Narbonne, Jourdan, Barrère, Moreau, Bernadotte, La Harpe, but also by Metternich, then secretary of the Austrian embassy, who carried on a flirtation with her all winter. All this was displeasing to Napoleon, more from wounded pride than fear of treason. In the midst of her social triumphs, after having one occasion received uncommon honor, Napoleon, now Emperor, bitterly exclaimed that more honor could not be shown to the wife of a Marshal of France, a remark very indicative of his character, showing that in his estimation there was no possible rank or fame to be compared with the laurels of a military hero. A great literary genius, or woman of transcendent beauty, was no more to him than a great scholar or philosopher is to a vulgar rich man in making up his parties. It was in the midst of these social successes that the husband of Madame Récamier lost his fortune. He would not have failed had he been able to secure a loan from the Bank of France of 1,000,000 of francs, but this loan the government peremptorily refused, doubtless from the hostility of Napoleon, so that the banker was ruined because his wife chose to ally herself with the old aristocracy and refuse the favors of the Emperor. In having pursued such a course, Madame Récamier must have known that she was the indirect cause of her husband's failure. But she bore the reverse of fortune with that equanimity which seems to be peculiar to the French, and which only lofty characters, or people of considerable mental resources, are able to assume or feel. Most rich men, when they lose their money, give way to despondency and grief, conscious that they have nothing to fall back upon, that without money they are nothing. Madame Récamier at once sold her jewels and plate, and her fine hotel was offered for sale. Neither she nor her husband sought to retain anything amid the wreck, and they cheerfully took up their abode in a small apartment, which conduct won universal sympathy and respect, so that her friends were rather increased than diminished, and she did not lose her social prestige and influence, which she would have lost in cities where money is the highest, and sometimes the only, test of social position. Madame de Staël wrote letters of impassioned friendship, and nobles and generals paid unwonted attention. The death of her mother soon followed, so that she spent the summer of 1807 in extreme privacy, until persuaded by her constant friend Madame de Staël to pay her a visit at her country seat near Geneva, where she met Prince Friedrich of Prussia, nephew of the great Friedrich, who became so enamored of her that he sought her hand in marriage. Princes in those days had such a lofty idea of their rank that they deemed it an honor to be conferred on a woman, even if married, to take her away from her husband. For a time Madame Récamier seemed dazzled with this splendid proposal, and she even wrote to the old banker, her husband, asking for a divorce from him. I think I never read of a request so preposterous or more disgraceful, the greatest flaw I know in her character, showing the extreme worldliness of women of fashion at that time, and the audacity which is created by universal flattery. What is even more surprising, her husband did not refuse the request, but wrote to her a letter of so much dignity, tenderness, and affection that her eyes were open. She saw the protector of her youth, whose indulgence had never failed her, growing old and despoiled of fortune; and to leave him who had been so good to her, even if she did not love him, seemed rightly the height of ingratitude and meanness. So the prince was dismissed, very much to his surprise and chagrin, and some there were who regarded Monsieur Récamier as a very selfish man, to appeal to the feelings and honor of his wife, and thus deprive her of a splendid destiny. Such were the morals of fashionable people in Europe during the 18th century. Madame Récamier did not meddle with politics like Madame de Staël and other strong-minded women before and since; but her friendship with a woman whom Napoleon hated so intensely as he did the authoress of Delphine and Germany, caused her banishment to a distance of 40 leagues from Paris, one of the customary acts which the great conqueror was not ashamed to commit, and which put his character in a repulsive light. Nothing was more odious in the character of Napoleon than his disdain of women, and his harsh and severe treatment of those who would not offer incense to him. Madame de Staël, on learning of the Emperor's resentment towards her friend, implored her not to continue to visit her, as it would certainly be reported to the government, and result in her banishment. But Madame Récamier would obey the impulses of friendship in the face of all danger. And the result was indeed her exile from that city which was so dear to her, as well as to all fashionable women and all gifted men. In exile this persecuted woman lived in a simple way, first at Chalons and then at Lyons, for her means were now small. Her companions, however, were great people, as before her banishment and in the days of her prosperity, in which fact we see some modification of the heartlessness which so often reigns in fashionable circles. Madame Récamier was never without friends as well as admirers. Her amiability, wit, good nature, and extraordinary fascinations always attracted gifted and accomplished people of the very highest rank. It was at Lyons that she formed a singular friendship, which lasted for life, and this was with a young man of plebeian origin, the son of a printer, with a face disfigured and with manners uncouth, Monsieur Ballanche, whose admiration amounted to absolute idolatry, and who demanded no other reward for his devotion than the privilege of worship. To be permitted to look at her and listen to her was enough for him. Though ugly in appearance and with a slow speech, he was well versed in the literature of the day, and his ideas were lofty and refined. I have never read of any one who has refused an unselfish idolatry, the incense of a worshipper who has no outward advantage to seek or gain, not even a king. If it be the privilege of a divinity to receive the homage of worshippers, why should a beautiful and kind-hearted woman reject the respectful adoration of a man contented with worship alone? What could be more flattering even to a woman of the world, especially if this man had noble traits and great cultivation? Such was Ballanche, who viewed the mistress of his heart as Dante did his Beatrice, though not with the same sublime elevation, for the object of Dante's devotion was on the whole imaginary, the worship of qualities which existed in his own mind alone, whereas the admiration of Ballanche was based on the real presence of flesh and blood animated by a lovely soul. Soon after this friendship had begun, Madame Récamier made a visit to Italy, travelling in a voiture, not a private carriage, and arrived at Rome in Passion Week, 1812, when the Pope was a prisoner of Napoleon at Fontainebleau, and hence when his capital was in mourning, sad and dull, guarded and occupied by French soldiers. The only society at Rome in that eventful year which preceded the declining fortunes of Napoleon was at the palace of Prince Torlonia the banker. But the modest apartment of Madame Récamier on the Corso was soon filled with those who detested the rule of Napoleon. Soon after, Ballanche came all the way from Lyons to see his star of worship, and she kindly took him everywhere, for even in desolation the Eternal City is the most interesting spot on the face of the globe. From Rome she went to Naples (December 1813), when King Murat was forced into the coalition against his brother-in-law. In spite of the hatred of Napoleon, his sister, the Queen of Naples, was devoted to the Queen of Beauty, who was received at court as an ambassadress rather than as an exile. On the fall of Napoleon the next year the Pope returned from his thraldom, and Madame Récamier, being again in Rome, witnessed one of the most touching scenes of those eventful days, when all the nobles and gentry went out to meet their spiritual and temporal sovereign, and amid the exultant shouts and rapture of the crowd, dragged his gilded carriage to St. Peter's Church, where was celebrated a solemn Te Deum. But Madame Récamier did not tarry long in Italy. She hastened back to Paris, for the tyrant was fallen. She was now no longer beaming in youthful charms, with groups of lovers at her feet, but a woman of middle age, yet still handsome, for such a woman does not lose her beauty at 35, with fresh sources of enjoyment and a keen desire for the society of intellectual and gifted friends. She now gave up miscellaneous society, that is, fashionable and dissipated crowds of men and women in noisy receptions and ceremonious parties, and drew around her the lines of a more exclusive circle. Hither came to see her Ballanche, now a resident of Paris, Mathieu de Montmorency, Monsieur de Chateaubriand, the Due de Broglie, and the most distinguished nobles of the ancient regime, with the literary lions who once more began to roar on the fall of the tyrant who had silenced them, including such men as Barante and Benjamin Constant. Also, great ladies were seen in her salon, for her husband's fortunes had improved, and she was enabled again to live in her old style of splendor. Among these ladies were the Duchess Ducars, the Marchioness de Podences, Castellon, and d'Aguesseau, and the Princess Royal of Sweden. Also distinguished foreigners sought her society: Wellington, Madame Krüdener, the friend of Emperor Alexander, the beautiful Duchess of Devonshire, the Duke of Hamilton, and whoever was most distinguished in that brilliant circle of illustrious people who congregated at Paris on the restoration of the Bourbons. Section 14 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 7, Great Women, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Madame Récamier, Part 2. In 1819 occurred the second failure of Madame Récamier, which necessarily led again to a new and more humble style of life. The home which Madame Récamier now selected, and where she lived until 1838, was the Abbaye aux Bois, while her father and her husband, the latter now 69, lived in a small lodging in the vicinity. She occupied in this convent a large old building in the Rue des Sèvres, a small appartement in the third story, with a brick floor, and uneven at that. She afterwards removed to a small appartement on the first floor, which looked upon the convent garden. Here, in this seclusion, impoverished and no longer young, Madame Récamier received her friends and guests. And they were among the most distinguished people of France, especially the Duc de Montmorency and the Viscount Chateaubriand. The former was a very religious man, and the breath of scandal never for a moment tainted his reputation, or cast any reproach on the memorable friendship which he cultivated with the most beautiful woman in France. This illustrious nobleman was at that time Minister of Foreign Affairs, and was sent to the celebrated Congress of Vienna, where Metternich, the greatest statesman of the age, presided, and inaugurated a reaction from the principles of the Revolution. But more famous than he was Chateaubriand, then ambassador at London, and afterwards joined with Montmorency as delegate to the Congress of Vienna, and still later Minister of Foreign Affairs, who held during the reign of Louis XVIII the most distinguished position in France as a statesman, a man of society, and a literary man. The author of The Genius of Christianity was aristocratic, moody, fickle, and vain, almost spoiled with the incense of popular idolatry. No literary man since Voltaire had received such incense. He was the acknowledged head of French literature, a man of illustrious birth, noble manners, poetical temperament, vast acquisitions, and immense social prestige. He took sad and desponding views of life, was intensely conservative, but had doubtless a lofty soul as well as intellectual supremacy. He occupied distinct spheres, was poet, historian, statesman, orator, and the oracle of fashionable salons, although he loved seclusion and detested crowds. The virtues of his private life were unimpeached, and no man was more respected by the nation than this cultivated scholar and gentleman of the old school. It was between this remarkable man and Madame Récamier that the most memorable friendship of modern times took place. It began in the year 1817 at the bedside of Madame de Staël, but did not ripen into intimacy until 1818, when he was 50 and she was 41. His genius and accomplishments soon conquered the first place in her heart, and he kept that place until his death in 1848, 30 years of ardent and reproachless friendship. Her other friends felt great inquietude in view of this friendship, fearing that the incurable melancholy and fitful moods of the Viscount would have a depressing influence on her. But she could not resist his fascinations any easier than he could resist hers. The Viscount visited her every day, generally in the afternoon, and when absent on his diplomatic missions to the various foreign courts, he wrote her, every day, all the details of his life, as well as sentiments. He constantly complained that she did not write as often as he did. His attachment was not prompted by that unselfish devotion which marked Ballanche, who sought no return, only the privilege of adoration. Chateaubriand was exacting, and sought a warmer and still increasing affection, which it seems was returned. Madame Récamier's nature was not passionate, it was simply affectionate. She sought to have the wants of her soul met. She rarely went to parties or assemblies, and seldom to the theatre. She craved friendship, and of the purest and loftiest kind. She was tired of the dissipation of society, and even of flatteries, of which the Viscount was equally weary. The delusions of life were dispelled, in her case at 40, in his at 50. This intimacy reminds us of that of Louis XIV. And Madame de Maintenon. Neither could live without the other. But their correspondence does not reveal any improper intimacy. It was purely spiritual and affectionate; it was based on mutual admiration; it was strengthened by mutual respect for each other's moral qualities. And the friendship gave rise to no scandal, nor was it in any way misrepresented. Every day the statesman, when immersed even in the cares of a great office, was seen at her modest dwelling at the same hour, about 4 o'clock, and no other visitors were received at that hour. After unbending his burdened soul, or communicating his political plans, or detailing the gossip of the day, all to the end of securing sympathy and encouragement from a great woman, he retired to his own hotel and spent the evening with his sick wife. One might suppose that his wife would have been jealous. The wife of Carlyle would never have permitted her husband to visit on such intimate terms the woman he most admired, Lady Ashburton, without a separation. But Chateaubriand's wife favored rather than discouraged the intimacy, knowing that it was necessary to his happiness. Nor did the friendship between Madame Récamier and the Duc de Montmorency, the political rival of Chateaubriand, weaken the love of the latter or create jealousy, a proof of his noble character. And when the pious Duke died, both friends gave way to the most sincere grief. It was impossible for Madame Récamier to live without friendship. She could give up society and fortune, but not her friends. The friendly circle was not large, but, as we have said, embraced the leading men of France. Her limited means made no difference with her guests, since these were friends and admirers. Her attraction to men and women alike did not decrease with age or poverty. The fall of Charles X. in 1830 led, of course, to the political downfall of Chateaubriand and many of Madame Récamier's best friends. But there was a younger class of an opposite school who now came forward, and the more eminent of these were also frequent visitors to the old queen of society, Ampère, Thiers, Mignet, Guizot, de Tocqueville, Sainte-Beuve. Nor did she lose the friendship, in her altered fortunes, of queens and nobles. She seems to have been received with the greatest cordiality in whatever chateau she chose to visit. Even Louis Napoleon, on his release from imprisonment in the castle of Ham, lost no time in paying his respects to the woman his uncle had formerly banished. One of the characteristic things which this interesting lady did was to get up a soirée in her apartments at the convent in aid of the sufferers of Lyons from an inundation of the Rhone, from which she realized a large sum. It was attended by the élite of Paris. Lady Byron paid 100 francs for her ticket. The Duc de Noailles provided the refreshments, the Marquis de Verac furnished the carriages, and Chateaubriand acted as master of ceremonies. Rachel acted in the rôle of Esther, not yet performed at the theatre, while Garcia, Rubini, and Lablache kindly gave their services. It was a very brilliant entertainment, one of the last in which Madame Récamier presided as a queen of society. It showed her kindness of heart, which was the most conspicuous trait of her character. She wished to please, but she desired still more to be of assistance. The desire to please may arise from blended vanity and good nature, The desire to be useful is purely disinterested. In all her intercourse with friends, we see in Madame Récamier a remarkable power of sympathy. She was not a woman of genius, but of amazing tact, kindness, and amiability. She entered with all her heart into the private and confidential communications of her friends, and was totally free from egotism, forgetting herself in the happiness of others. If not a woman of genius, she had extraordinary good sense, and her advice was seldom wrong. It was this union of sympathy, kindness, tact, and wisdom which made Madame Récamier's friendship so highly prized by the greatest men of the age. But she was exclusive. She did not admit everybody to her salon, only those whom she loved and esteemed, generally from the highest social circle. Sympathy cannot exist except among equals. We associate Paulo with Jerome, the Countess Matilda with Hildebrand, Vittoria Colonna with Michelangelo, Hannah More with Dr. Johnson. Friendship is neither patronage nor philanthropy, and the more exalted the social or political or literary position, the more rare friendship is and the more beautiful when it shines. It was the friendships of Madame Récamier with distinguished men and women which made her famous more than her graces and beauty. She soothed, encouraged, and fortified the soul of Chateaubriand in his fits of depression and under political disappointments, always herself cheerful and full of vivacity, an angel of consolation and spiritual radiance. Her beauty at this period was moral rather than physical, since it revealed the virtues of the heart and the quickness of spiritual insight. In her earlier days, the object of universal and unbounded admiration, from her unparalleled charms and fascinations, she may have coquetted more than can be deemed decorous of a lady of fashion; but if so, it was vanity and love of admiration which were the causes. She never appealed to passion, for, as we have said, her own nature was not passionate. She was satisfied to be worshipped. The love of admiration is not often allied with that passion which loses self control, and buries one in the gulf of mad infatuation. The mainspring of her early life was to please, and of her later life to make people happy. A more unselfish woman never lived. Those beauties who lure to ruin, as did the sirens, are ever heartless and selfish, like Cleopatra and Madame de Pompadour. There is nothing on this earth more selfish than what foolish and inexperienced people often mistake for love. There is nothing more radiant and inspiring than the moral beauty of the soul. The love that this creates is tender, sympathetic, kind, and benevolent. Nothing could be more unselfish and beautiful than the love with which Madame Récamier inspired Blanche, who had nothing to give and nothing to ask but sympathy and kindness. One of the most touching and tender friendships ever recorded was the intercourse between Chateaubriand and Madame Récamier when they were both old and infirm. Nothing is more interesting than their letters and daily interviews at the convent, where she spent her latter days. She was not only poor, but she had also become blind, and had lost all relish for fashionable society. Not a religious recluse, saddened and penitent, like the Duchess de Longueville in the Vale of Chevreuse, but still a cheerful woman, fond of music, of animated talk, and of the political news of the day. Chateaubriand was old, disenchanted, disappointed, melancholy, and full of infirmities. Yet he never failed in the afternoon to make his appearance at the Abbaye, driven in a carriage to the threshold of the salon, where he was placed in an armchair and wheeled to a corner of the fireplace, when he poured out his sorrows and received consolation. Once, on one of those dreary visits, he asked his friend to marry him, he being then 79 and she 71, and bear his illustrious name. "Why," said she, "should we marry at our age? There is no impropriety in my taking care of you. If solitude is painful to you, I am ready to live in the same house with you. The world will do justice to the purity of our friendship. Years and blindness give me this right. Let us change nothing in so perfect an affection." The old statesman and historian soon after died, broken in mind and body, living long enough to see the fall of Louis Philippe. In losing this friend of 30 years, Madame Récamier felt that the mainspring of her life was broken. She shed no tears in her silent and submissive grief, nor did she repel consolation or the society of friends; but the sad smile which played on her lips was heartrending. While witnessing the decline of this noble genius, she had struggled, with singular tenderness, against the terrible effect of years upon him; but the long struggle had exhausted her own strength, and all motives for life were gone. Though now old and blind, yet, like Madame du Deffand at 80, Madame Récamier's attractions never passed away. The great and the distinguished still visited her, and pronounced her charming to the last. Her vivacity never deserted her, nor her desire to make every one happy around her. She was kept interesting to the end by the warmth of her affections and the brightness of her mind. As it is the soul which is the glory of a woman, so the soul sheds its rays of imperishable light on the last pathway of existence. No beauty ever utterly passes away when animated by what is immortal. Madame Récamier died at last of cholera, that disease which of all others she had ever most dreaded and avoided. On the 11th of May, 1849, amid weeping relatives and kneeling servants, and sacerdotal prayers, this interesting woman passed away from earth. To her might be applied the eulogy of Burke on Marie Antoinette. Madame Récamier's place in society has never since been filled with equal grace and fascination. She adopted the customs of the Hôtel de Rambouillet, certain rules which good society has since observed. She discouraged the tête à tête in a low voice in a mixed company. If anyone in her circle was likely to have especial knowledge, she would appeal to him with an air of deference. If anyone was shy, she encouraged him. If a mot was particularly happy, she would take it up and show it to the company. Presiding in her own salon, she talked but little herself, but rather exerted herself to draw others out. Without being learned, she exercised great judgment in her decisions when appeals were made to her as the presiding genius. She discouraged everything pedantic and pretentious. She dreaded exaggerations. She kept her company to the subject under discussion, and compelled attention. She would allow no slang. She insisted upon good nature and amiability, which more than anything else marked society in the 18th century. We read so much of those interesting reunions in the salons of distinguished people in the 17th and 18th centuries, that we naturally seek to know what constituted their peculiar charm. It seems to me to have been conversation, which is both an art and a gift. In these exclusive meetings women did not reign in consequence of their beauty so much as their wit. Their vivacity, intelligence, and tact, I may also add their good nature, were a veil to cover up all eccentricities. It was when Madame du Deffand was 80 and blind that Horace Walpole pronounced her to be the most interesting woman in France. Madame de Staël, never beautiful, was the life of a party at 45. Madame Récamier was in her glory at 50. Hannah More was most sought when she was 60. There can be no high society where conversation is not the chief attraction, and men seldom learn to talk well when not inspired by gifted women. They may dictate like Dr. Johnson, or preach like Coleridge in a circle of admirers, or give vent to sarcasms and paradoxes like Carlyle. But they do not please like Horace Walpole, or dazzle like Wilkes, or charm like Mackintosh. When society was most famous at Paris, it was the salon, not the card table, or the banquet, or the ball, which was most sought by cultivated men and women, where conversation was directed by gifted women. Women are nothing in the social circle who cannot draw out the sentiments of able men, and a man of genius gains more from the inspiration of one brilliant woman than from all the bookworms of many colleges. In society, a bright and witty woman not merely shines, but she reigns. Conversation brings out all her faculties, and kindles all her sensibilities, and gives expression to her deepest sentiments. Her talk is more than music; it is music rising to the heights of eloquence. She is more even than an artist; she is a goddess before whom genius delights to burn its incense. Success in this great art of conversation depends as much upon the disposition as upon the brains. The remarkable women who reigned in the salons of the last century were all distinguished for their good nature based on toleration and kind feeling rather than on insipid acquiescence. There can be no animated talk without dissent, and dissent should be disguised by the language of courtesy. As vanity is one of the mainsprings of human nature, and is nearly universal, the old queens of society had the tact to hide what could not easily be extirpated, and they were adepts in the still greater art of seeming to be unconscious. Those people are ever the most agreeable who listen with seeming curiosity, and who conceal themselves in order to feed the vanity of others. Nor does a true artist force his wit. A confirmed punster is as great a bore as a patronizing moralist. Moreover, the life of society depends upon the general glow of the party, rather than the prominence of an individual, so that a brilliant talker will seek to bring out the coincidence which strengthens conviction, or the dissent which sharpens sagacity, rather than individual experiences which ever seem to be egotistical. In agreeable society all egotism is to be crushed and crucified. Even a man who is an oracle, if wise, will suggest rather than seem to instruct. In a congenial party all differences in rank are for the time ignored. It is in bad taste to remind or impress people with a sense of their inferiority, as in chivalry all degrees were forgotten in an assemblage of gentlemen. Animated conversation amuses without seeming to teach, and transfers ideas so skilfully into the minds of others that they are ignorant of the debt, and mistake them for their own. It kindles a healthy enthusiasm, promotes good nature, repels pretension, and rebukes vanity. It even sets off beauty, and intensifies its radiance. Said Madame de Lafayette to Madame de Sévigné, "Your varying expression so brightens and adorns your beauty that there is nothing so brilliant as yourself. Every word you utter adds to the brightness of your eyes, and while it is said that language impresses only the ear, it is quite certain that yours enchants the vision." Like style in writing, says Lamartine, conversation must flow with ease or it will oppress. It must be clear, or depth of thought cannot be penetrated; simple, or the understanding will be overtasked; restrained, or redundancy will satiate; warm, or it will lack soul; witty, or the brain will not be excited; generous, or sympathy cannot be roused; gentle, or there will be no toleration; persuasive, or the passions cannot be subdued. When it unites these excellences, it has an irresistible power. Musical as was Apollo's lyre, a perpetual feast of nectared sweets, such as, I fancy, Socrates poured out to Athenian youth, or Augustine in the gardens of Como; an electrical glow, such as united the members of the Turk's Head Club into a band of brothers, or annihilated all distinctions of rank at the supper table of the poet Scarron. We cannot easily overrate the influence of those who inspire the social circle. They give not only the greatest pleasure which is known to cultivated minds, but kindle lofty sentiments. They draw men from the whirlpools of folly, break up degrading habits, dissipate the charms of money making, and raise the value of the soul. How charming, how delightful, how inspiring is the eloquence which is kindled by the attrition of gifted minds! What privilege is greater than to be with those who reveal the experiences of great careers, especially if there be the absence of vanity and ostentation, and encouragement by those whose presence is safety and whose smiles are an inspiration? It is the blending of the beatitudes of Bethany with the artistic enjoyments of Weimar, causing the favored circle to forget all cares, and giving them strength for those duties which make up the main business of human life. When woman accomplishes such results, she fills no ordinary sphere, she performs no ordinary mission, she rises in dignity as she declines in physical attractions. Like a queen of beauty at the tournament, she bestows the rewards which distinguished excellence has won; she breaks up the distinctions of rank, she rebukes the arrogance of wealth, she destroys pretensions, she kills self conceit, she even gains consideration for her husband or brother; for many a stupid man is received into a select circle because of the attractions of his wife or sister, even as many a silly woman gains consideration from the talents or position of her husband or brother. No matter how rich a man may be, if unpolished, ignorant, or rude, he is nobody in a party which seeks the feast of reason and the flow of soul. He is utterly insignificant, rebuked, and humiliated, even as a brainless beauty finds herself de trop in a circle of wits. Such a man may have consideration in the circle which cannot appreciate anything lofty or refined, but none in those upper regions where art and truth form subjects of discourse, where the aesthetic influences of the heart go forth to purify and exalt, where the soul is refreshed by the communion of gifted and sympathetic companions, and where that which is most precious and exalted in a man or woman is honored and beloved. Without this influence which woman controls, a learned man is in danger of becoming a pedant, a religious man a bigot, a vain man a fool, and a self indulgent man a slave. No man can be truly genial unless he has been taught in the school where his wife or daughter or sister or mother presides as a sun of radiance and beauty. It is only in this school that boorish manners are reformed, egotisms rebuked, stupidities punished, and cynicism exorcised. But this exalting influence cannot exist in society without an attractive power in those ladies who compose it. A crowd of women does not necessarily make society any more than do the empty, stupid, and noisy receptions which are sometimes held in the houses of the rich; still less those silly, flippant, ignorant, pretentious, unblushing, and exacting girls who have just escaped from a fashionable school, who elbow their brothers into corners, and cover with confusion their fathers and mothers. A mere assemblage of men and women is nothing without the charms of refinement, vivacity, knowledge, and good nature. These are not born in a day; they seldom mark people until middle life, when experiences are wide and feelings deep, when flippancy is not mistaken for wit, nor impertinence for ease. A frivolous slave of dress and ornament can no more belong to the circle of which I now speak than can a pushing masculine woman to the sphere which she occasionally usurps. Not dress, not jewelry, not pleasing manners, not even innocence is the charm and glory of society, but the wisdom learned by experience, the knowledge acquired by study, the quickness based on native genius. When woman has thus acquired these great resources, by books, by travel, by extended intercourse, and by the soaring of an untrammelled soul, then only does she shine and guide and inspire, and become, not the equal of man, but his superior, his mentor, his guardian angel, his star of worship in that favored and glorious realm which is alike the paradise and the empire of the world. Authorities: Miss J. M. Looster's Memoir of Madame Récamier. Memoirs and Correspondence by Lenormant. Marquis of Salisbury's Historical Sketches. Mrs. Thomson's Queens of Society. Guizot's Sketch of Madame Récamier. Biographie Universelle. Dublin Review, 57 to 88. Christian Examiner, 82 to 299. Quarterly Review, 107 to 298. Edinburgh Review, 111 to 204. North British Review, 32. Bentley's Magazine, 26 to 96. The Nation, 3, 4, 15. Fraser's Magazine, 40 to 264. End of section 14. Section 15 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 7, Great Women, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Madame de Staël, Part 1. A.D. 1766 to 1817. Woman in Literature. It was 200 years after woman began to reign in the great cities of Europe as queen of society before she astonished the world by brilliant literary successes. Some of the most famous women who adorned society recorded their observations and experiences for the benefit of posterity, but these productions were generally in the form of memoirs and letters, which neither added to nor detracted from the splendid position they occupied because of their high birth, wit, and social fascinations. These earlier favorites were not courted by the great because they could write, but because they could talk and adorn courts, like Madame de Sévigné. But in the 18th century a class of women arose and gained great celebrity on account of their writings, like Hannah More, Miss Burney, Miss Macaulay, Madame Dacier, Madame de Lafayette, women who proved that they could do something more than merely write letters, for which women have ever been distinguished from the time of Héloïse. At the head of all these women of genius, Madame de Staël stands preeminent, not only over literary women, but also over most of the men of letters in her age and country. And it was only a great age which could have produced such a woman, for the 18th century was more fruitful in literary genius than is generally supposed. The greatest lights indeed no longer shone, such men as Shakespeare, Bacon, Milton, Corneille, Racine, Boileau, Molière. But the age was fruitful in great critics, historians, philosophers, economists, poets, and novelists, who won immortal fame, like Pope, Goldsmith, Johnson, Addison, Gibbon, Bentley, Hume, Robertson, Priestley, Burke, Adam Smith in England, Klopstock, Goethe, Herder, Schiller, Lessing, Handel, Schlegel, Kant in Germany, and Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Marmontel, D'Alembert, Montesquieu, Rollin, Buffon, Lavoisier, Raynal, Lavater in France, all of whom were remarkable men, casting their fearless glance upon all subjects, and agitating the age by their great ideas. In France especially there was a notable literary awakening. A more brilliant circle than ever assembled at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, met in the salons of Madame Geoffrin and Madame de Tencin and Madame du Deffand and Madame Necker, to discuss theories of government, political economy, human rights, in fact, every question which moves the human mind. They were generally irreligious, satirical, and defiant, but they were fresh, enthusiastic, learned, and original. They not only aroused the people to reflection, but they were great artists in language and made a revolution in style. It was in this inquiring, brilliant, yet infidel age that the star of Madame de Staël arose, on the eve of the French Revolution. She was born in Paris in 1766, when her father, Necker, was amassing an enormous fortune as a banker and financier, afterwards so celebrated as finance minister to Louis XVI. Her mother, Suzanne Cherchot, of humble Swiss parentage, was yet one of the remarkable women of the day, a lady whom Gibbon would have married had English prejudices and conventionalities permitted, but whose marriage with Necker was both fortunate and happy. They had only one child, but she was a Minerva. It seems that she was of extraordinary precocity, and very early attracted attention. As a mere child, Marmontel talked with her as if she were 25. At 15 she had written reflections on Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, and was solicited by Raynal to furnish an article on the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So brilliant a girl was educated by her wealthy parents without regard to expense and with the greatest care. She was fortunate from the start, with unbounded means, surrounded with illustrious people, and with every opportunity for improvement both as to teachers and society, doubtless one important cause of her subsequent success, for very few people climb the upper rounds of the ladder of literary fame who are obliged to earn their living. Their genius is fettered and their time is employed on irksome drudgeries. Madame de Staël, when a girl, came very near losing her health and breaking her fine constitution by the unwise cramming on which her mother insisted. For although a superior woman, Madame Necker knew very little about the true system of education, thinking that study and labor should be incessant, and that these alone could do everything. She loaded her daughter with too many restraints, and bound her by too rigid a discipline. She did all she could to crush genius out of the girl, and make her a dictionary, or a machine, or a piece of formality and conventionalism. But the father, wiser and with greater insight and truer sympathy, relaxed the cords of discipline, unfettered her imagination, connived at her flights of extravagance, and allowed her to develop her faculties in her own way. She had a remarkable fondness for her father; she adored him, and clung to him through life with peculiar tenderness and devotion, which he appreciated and repaid. Before she was 20 she wrote poetry as a matter of course. Most girls do, I mean those who are bright and sentimental. Still she produced but indifferent work, like Cicero when he was young, and soon dropped rhyme forever for the greater freedom of prose, into which she poured from the first all the wealth of her poetic soul. She was a poet, disdaining measure, but exquisite in rhythm, for nothing can be more musical than her style. As remarked in the lecture on Madame Récamier, it is seldom that people acquire the art of conversation till middle life, when the mind is enriched and confidence is gained. The great conversational powers of Johnson, Burke, Mackintosh, Coleridge, Wilkes, Garrick, Walpole, Sydney Smith, were most remarkable in their later years, after they had read everything and seen everybody. But Madame de Staël was brilliant in conversation from her youth. She was the delight of every circle, the admiration of the most gifted men, not for her beauty, for she was not considered beautiful, but for her wit, her vivacity, her repartee, her animated and sympathetic face, her electrical power, for she could kindle, inspire, instruct, or bewitch. She played, she sang, she discoursed on everything, a priestess, a sibyl full of inspiration, listened to as an oracle or an idol. To hear her, says Sismondi, one would have said that she was the experience of many souls mingled into one. I looked and listened with transport. I discovered in her features a charm superior to beauty, and if I do not hear her words, yet her tones, her gestures, and her looks convey to me her meaning. It is said that though her features were not beautiful, her eyes were remarkable, large, dark, lustrous, animated, flashing, confiding, and bathed in light. They were truly the windows of her soul, and it was her soul, even more than her intellect, which made her so interesting and so great. I think that intellect without soul is rather repulsive than otherwise, is cold, critical, arrogant, cynical, something from which we flee, since we find no sympathy and sometimes no toleration from it. The soul of Madame de Staël immeasurably towered above her intellect, great as that was, and gave her eloquence, fervor, sincerity, poetry, intensified her genius, and made her irresistible. It was this combination of wit, sympathy, and conversational talent which made Madame de Staël so inordinately fond of society, to satisfy longings and cravings that neither nature nor books nor home could fully meet. With all her genius and learning, she was a restless woman, and even friendship, for which she had a great capacity, could not bind her, or confine her long to any one place but Paris, which was to her the world. Not for its shops or fashions or churches or museums and picture galleries or historical monuments and memories, but for those coteries where blazed the great wits of the age, among whom she too would shine and dazzle and inspire. She was not without heart, as her warm and lasting friendships attest, but the animating passion of her life was love of admiration, which was only equalled by a craving for sympathy that no friendship could satisfy. A want of her nature that reveals an ardent soul rather than a great heart, for many a warm-hearted woman can live contentedly in retirement, whether in city or country, which Madame de Staël could not even when surrounded with every luxury and all the charms of nature. Such a young lady as Mademoiselle Necker, so gifted, so accomplished, so rich, so elevated in social position, could aspire very high; and both her father and mother were ambitious for so remarkable a daughter. But the mother would not consent to her marriage with a Catholic, and she herself insisted on a permanent residence in Paris. It was hard to meet such conditions and yet make a brilliant match, for after all, her father, though minister, was only a clever and rich Swiss financier, not a nobleman or a man of great family influence. The Baron de Staël Holstein, then secretary to the Swedish embassy, afterwards ambassador from Sweden, was the most available suitor, since he was a nobleman, a Protestant, and a diplomatist; and Mademoiselle Necker became his wife in 1786, at 20 years of age, with a dowry of 2 millions of francs. Her social position was raised by this marriage, since her husband was a favorite at court, and she saw much of the queen and of the great ladies who surrounded her. But the marriage was not happy. The husband was extravagant and self-indulgent; the wife panted for beatitudes it was not in his nature to give. So they separated after a while, but were not divorced. Both before and after that event, however, her house was the resort of the best society of the city, and she was its brightest ornament. Thither came Grimm, Talleyrand, Barnave, Lafayette, Narbonne, Sieyès, all friends. She was an eye-witness to the terrible scenes of the Revolution, and escaped judicial assassination almost by miracle. At last she succeeded in making her escape to Switzerland, and lived a while in her magnificent country seat near Geneva, surrounded with illustrious exiles. Soon after, she made her first visit to England, but returned to Paris when the violence of the Revolution was over. She returned the very day that Napoleon, as First Consul, had seized the reins of the government, 1799. She had hailed the Revolution with transport, although she was so nearly its victim. She had faith in its ideas. She believed that the people were the ultimate source of power. She condoned the excesses of the Revolution in view of its aspirations. Napoleon gained his first great victories in defence of its ideas. So at first, in common with the friends of liberty, she was prepared to worship this rising sun, dazzled by his deeds and deceived by his lying words. But she no sooner saw him than she was repelled, especially when she knew he had trampled on the liberties which he had professed to defend. Her instincts penetrated through all the plaudits of his idolaters. She felt that he was a traitor to a great cause, was heartless, unboundedly ambitious, insufferably egotistic, a self-worshipper, who would brush away everything and everybody that stood in his way; and she hated him, and she defied him, and her house became the centre of opposition, the headquarters of enmity and wrath. What was his glory as a conqueror compared with the cause she loved, trodden under foot by an iron, rigid, jealous, irresistible despotism? Nor did Napoleon like her any better than she liked him, not that he was envious, but because she stood in his way. He expected universal homage and devotion, neither of which she would give him. He was exceedingly irritated at the reports of her bitter sayings, blended with ridicule and sarcasm. He was not merely annoyed, he was afraid. "Her arrows," said he, "would hit a man if he were seated on a rainbow." And when he found he could not silence her, he banished her to within 40 leagues of Paris. He was not naturally cruel, but he was not the man to allow so bright a woman to say her sharp things about him to his generals and courtiers. It was not the worst thing he ever did to banish his greatest enemy, but it was mean and cruel to persecute her as he did after she was banished. So from Paris, to her the hub of the universe, Madame de Staël, with wandering steps and slow, took her solitary way. Expelled from the Eden she loved, she sought to find some place where she could enjoy society, which was the passion of her life. Weimar, in Germany, then contained a constellation of illustrious men, over whom Goethe reigned, as Dr. Johnson once did in London. Thither she resolved to go, after a brief stay at Coppet, her place in Switzerland, and her 10 years' exile began with a sojourn among the brightest intellects of Germany. She was cordially received at Weimar, especially by the court, although the dictator of German literature did not like her much. She was too impetuous, impulsive, and masculine for him. Schiller and Wieland and Schlegel liked her better and understood her better. Her great works had not then been written, and she had a reputation chiefly for her high social position and social qualities. Possibly her exceeding vivacity and wit seemed superficial, as witty French people then seemed to both Germans and English. Doubtless there were critics and philosophers in Germany who were not capable of appreciating a person who aspired to penetrate all the secrets of art, philosophy, religion, and science then known, who tried to master everything, and who talked eloquently on everything, and that person a woman, and a Frenchwoman. Goethe was indeed an exception to most German critics, for he was an artist, as few Germans have been in the use of language, and he, like Humboldt, had universal knowledge. Yet he did not like Madame de Staël, not from envy; he had too much self-consciousness to be envious of any man, still less a woman. Envy does not exist between the sexes. A musician may be jealous of a musician, a poet of a poet, a theologian of a theologian; and it is said a physician has been known to be jealous of a physician. I think it is probable that the gifted Frenchwoman overwhelmed the great German with her prodigality of wit, sarcasm, and sentiment, for he was inclined to coldness and taciturnity. Madame de Staël speaks respectfully of the great men she met at Weimar; but I do not think she worshipped them, since she did not fully understand them, especially Fichte, whom she ridiculed, as well as other obscure though profound writers, who disdained style and art in writing, for which she was afterwards so distinguished. I believe 9/10 of German literature is wasted on Europeans for lack of clearness and directness of style, although the involved obscurities which are common to German philosophers and critics and historians alike do not seem to derogate from their literary fame at home, and have even found imitators in England, like Coleridge and Carlyle. Nevertheless, obscurity and affectation are eternal blots on literary genius, since they are irreconcilable with art, which alone gives perpetuity to learning, as illustrated by the classic authors of antiquity, and such men as Pascal, Rousseau, and Macaulay in our times; although the pedants have always disdained those who write clearly and luminously, and lost reverence for genius the moment it is understood, since clear writing shows how little is truly original, and makes a disquisition on a bug, a comma, or a date seem trivial indeed. Hitherto Madame de Staël had reigned in salons rather than on the throne of letters. Until her visit to Germany she had written but two books which had given her fame: one, On Literature Considered in its Relations with Social Institutions, and a novel entitled Delphine, neither of which is much read or prized in these times. The leading idea of her book on literature was the perfectibility of human nature, not new, since it had been affirmed by Ferguson in England, by Kant in Germany, and by Turgot in France, and even by Roger Bacon in the Middle Ages. But she claimed to be the first to apply perfectibility to literature. If her idea simply means the ever expanding progress of the human mind, with the aids that Providence has furnished, she is doubtless right. If she means that the necessary condition of human nature, unaided, is towards perfection, she wars with Christianity and agrees with Rousseau. The idea was fashionable in its day, especially by the disciples of Rousseau, who maintained that the majority could not err. But if Madame de Staël simply meant that society was destined to progressive advancement, as a matter of fact her view will be generally accepted, since God rules this world and brings good out of evil. Some maintain we have made no advance over ancient India in either morals or literature or science, or over Greece in art, or Rome in jurisprudence, and yet we believe the condition of humanity to day is superior to what it has been, on the whole, in any previous age of our world. But let us give the credit of this advance to God, and not to man. Her other book, Delphine, published in 1802, made a great sensation, like a modern first-class novel, but was severely criticized. Sidney Smith reviewed it in a slashing article. It was considered by many as immoral in its tendency, since she was supposed to attack marriage. Sainte-Beuve, the greatest critic of the age, defends her against this charge, but the book was doubtless very emotional, into which she poured all the warmth of her ardent and ungoverned soul in its restless agitation and cravings for sympathy, a record of herself, blasted in her marriage hopes and aspirations. It is a sort of new Héloïse, and, though powerful, is not healthy. These two works, however, stamped her as a woman of genius, although her highest triumphs were not yet won. With the éclat of these two books she traversed Germany, studying laws, literature, and manners, assisted in her studies by August v. Schlegel, the translator of Shakespeare, who was tutor to her children, on a salary of 12,000 francs a year and expenses. She had great admiration for this distinguished scholar, who combined with his linguistic attainments an intense love of art and a profound appreciation of genius, in whatever guise it was to be found. With such a cicerone she could not help making great acquisitions. He was like Jerome explaining to Paulo the history of the sacred places, like Dr. Johnson teaching ethics to Hannah More, like Michaelangelo explaining the principles of art to Vittoria Colonna. She mastered the language of which Frederick the Great was ashamed, and, for the first time, did justice to the German scholars and the German character. She defended the ideal philosophy against Locke and the French materialists. She made a remarkable analysis of Kant. She warmly praised both Goethe and Schiller. She admired Wieland. She had a good word for Fichte, although she had ridiculed his obscurities of style. The result of her travels was the most masterly dissertation on that great country that has ever been written, an astonishing book when we remember it was the first of any note which had appeared of its kind. To me it is more like the history of Herodotus than any book of travels which has appeared since that accomplished scholar traversed Asia and Africa to reveal to his inquisitive countrymen the treasures of Oriental monarchies. In this work, which is intellectually her greatest, she towered not only over all women, but over all men who have since been her competitors. It does not fall in with my purpose to give other than a passing notice of this masterly production in order to show what a marvelous woman she was, not in the realm of sentiment alone, not as a writer of letters, but as a critic capable of grasping and explaining all that philosophy, art, and literature have sought to accomplish in that terra incognita, as Germany was then regarded. She revealed a new country to the rest of Europe. She described with accuracy its manners and customs. She did justice to the German intellect. She showed what amazing scholarship already existed in the universities, far surpassing both Paris and Oxford. She appreciated the German character, its simplicity, its truthfulness, its sincerity, its intellectual boldness, its patience, its reserved power, afterwards to be developed in war, qualities and attainments which have since raised Germany to the foremost rank among the European nations. This brilliant Frenchwoman, accustomed to reign in the most cultivated social circles of Paris, shows a remarkable catholicity and breadth of judgment, and is not shocked at phlegmatic dullness or Hyperborean awkwardness or laughable simplicity, because she sees, what nobody else then saw, a patience which never wearies, a quiet enthusiasm which no difficulty or disgust destroys, and a great insight which can give richness to literature without art, discrimination to philosophy without consciousness, and a new meaning to old dogmas. She ventures to pluck from the forbidden tree of metaphysics, and, reckless of the fiats of the schools, she entered fearlessly into those inquiries which have appalled both Greek and schoolmen. Think of a woman making the best translation and criticism of Kant which had appeared until her day. Her revelations might have found more value in the eyes of pedants had she been more obscure. But as Sir James Mackintosh says, dullness is not accuracy, nor is an elegant writer necessarily superficial. Divest German metaphysics of their obscurities, and they might seem commonplace. Take away the clearness of French writers, and they might pass for profound. Clearness and precision, however, are not what the world expects from its teachers. It loves the fig trees with nothing but leaves. It adores the stat magni nominis umbra. The highest proof of severe culture is the use of short and simple words on any subject whatever, and he who cannot make his readers understand what he writes about does not understand his subject himself. Section 16.